If you only hear me say one thing today, let it be thank you. Thank you to all of you who already support Urban Ministries' mission. Thank you for all of you who might one day. Anytime you give to the broken places of the world, you're a part of changing lives. You may have heard of West End before, Birmingham's West End. It's the home of the Princeton Baptist Medical Center, which is a fine hospital. It's also the site of the Elmwood Cemetery, which any good Alabama fan would know is where Bear Bryant is buried. But apart from the hospital and the cemetery, most folks who don't live there avoid our side of town. West End doesn't have the best reputation. When you hear about it on the news, it's usually bad news. The homicides, the crime, the failing schools, the poverty, the list goes on and on and on. The reputation of the neighborhood reminds me of a scripture passage that comes from the first chapter of the Gospel of John. Jesus starts calling his disciples. He calls Philip. Philip runs across town, finds his friend Nathanael, and says, "Nathanael, guess what? Jesus, the Messiah of Nazareth, is here." To which Nathanael responds, "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Apparently, Jesus lived on the wrong side of the tracks. Nazareth. You know, that kind of neighborhood that no one goes to unless they live there. Nazareth, the bad side of town. I can hear Nathanael as clear as a whistle. Nazareth, the homicides, the failing schools, the lack of transportation, medical insurance is a scarcity. The list goes on and on and on. Sometimes we forget that Jesus was poor. He lived his whole life in poverty. He was born homeless with nowhere to lay his head. He was always around poor people, sick people who couldn't afford a doctor, hungry people, thirsty people, broken people. In fact, Jesus was around poor people so much, it's safe to say that if you weren't around poor people when Jesus was alive in flesh, you never would have heard him preach. Sometimes we forget that Jesus was poor. Now, it's not entirely our fault that we forget it. About 300 years after Jesus died, Christianity shifted from a poor person's religion to the official religion of the Roman Empire, the empire that crucified Christ. Churches that used to meet in humble homes filled with orphans, widows, and strangers moved into the grandest, most expensive cathedrals on the face of the earth. It makes sense that we forget that Jesus was poor. Now, I want you to close your eyes with me just for a minute and imagine what Jesus looks like. Well, for me, he doesn't look poor. He's got pale skin, striking blue eyes. He clearly washed, shampooed, conditioned his long brown hair. His beard is trimmed. He doesn't look dirty, doesn't look poor. He even had time to bathe that little lamb in his arms, right? He doesn't look poor. Our pictures of us tell us otherwise. My wife, my mother-in-law tells me, was a very talkative toddler. She talked really early and stole the show at every church's children's moment. One day they were at church and the pastor called the kids to the step and he sat down. He was telling the kids about the second coming of Christ. And he said, "Children, listen. When Jesus comes back, we won't know what he'll look like, so you need to love everyone as if you're loving Christ." Well, immediately, Caitlin, my wife's hand shot up, and he said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I'll know what he'll look like." He said, "You will." And she stood up, all 3 foot tall, marched over to a picture on the wall and said, "We've got a picture of him right there." And in that picture, he looked like the royal, wealthiest, cleanest shepherd you ever saw. Sometimes we forget that Jesus was poor. Now, apparently, I come close to some people's mind-eye image of Jesus. I delivered Papa John's pizza in high school. And one night, I pulled up my truck to this lady's house. I got the pizzas out of the passenger seat. I walked up and knocked on her door. A young mother opened the door, looked deeply into my eyes, turned around and said, "Kids, come quick! Jesus Christ is delivering our pizza." The kids ran down the stairs, and it was kind of an awkward moment at the door. I didn't know what to say, so I pulled the pizzas out of the bag. I lifted them up, and I said, "Children, man does not live by pizza alone." I passed her the box. She reached into her pocket, grabbed a wad of cash, put it in my hand, and I walked out to the truck thinking, "Score, this is going to be a great tip." And you wouldn't believe it. A self-proclaimed Christian only tipping Jesus Christ a lousy $2. The guys who were illegally gambling in the hotel room across the street gave me a $10 bill off the top of the pile, right? Sometimes we forget that Jesus was poor. And in our attempts to be like Jesus, we accidentally just make Jesus look like us. But thank God for the Gospels that remind us time and time again who Jesus was in flesh. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a homeowner. He was not even a citizen of the country that he lived. Jesus was poor. Our scripture today reminds us of this truth. It comes from the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus tells a parable. He says, when the Son of Man comes in all of his glory, he will gather people of all nations, and he will separate us as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. For all of you who chose to sit over here, if you move to that side, please do so quietly. And then he turns to those at his right, and he says, "You are blessed. Thank you. Because when I was hungry and thirsty, you fed me. When I was sick, you took care of me. You shared clothes with me. When I was in prison, you visited me." But the sheep were confused. They scratched their heads and they said, "Jesus, what are you talking about? When did we love you?" "Whenever you did it to the least of these, who are members of my family, you were doing it to me." And then he turns to those at his left and he says, "You are wicked and you will be punished, because when I was hungry and thirsty, you walked right by me. You didn't even make eye contact with me. And when I needed clothes, you didn't share. When I was sick, you were never there. When I was in prison, you never visited." But the goats were also confused and probably nervous. And they scratched their heads and they said, "Jesus, what are you talking about? We love you. We would never do that. When did we neglect you?" He said, "Whenever you did it to the least of these, who were members of my family, you were doing it to me." Jesus makes his point loud and clear. When we love people living in poverty, we are loving Christ. It's perhaps the clearest message of any of Jesus' parables. Most of the time when Jesus tells a parable, it leaves the disciples confused. They're scratching their heads saying, "Wait, Jesus, wait, what is what and who is who and which is, how does it go?" Most of the time, parables have 1,000 different interpretations, a moral for each individual person, but not here. Some scholars argue that the genre parable requires confusion and multiple morals. Therefore, they say, we can no longer call this the parable of the sheep and the goats. It must be called simply the story of the sheep and the goats. While I agree with those scholars that the moral is clear, there is one twist. There's one trap door in this story that had me hung up for years. You see, you and I have heard the parable of the sheep and the goats. And so we know the moral of the story. When we serve the least of these, we are loving Christ. But the people in the parable did not have it to teach them the lesson, which raises the question, why did the sheep love Jesus even though they didn't know they were loving him? For years, I've directed senior high camp at Camp Simatonga. About 10 years ago, the theme of the summer was love your neighbor as yourself, and the campers put on a skit that I'll never forget. The skit took place in the assembly hall, which is this big, open, rustic pole shack of a building, no AC, walls and windows, has a stage. The kids called the skit Calling a Realtor, and it went like this. A girl came in from this side of the stage, and she had a phone in her hand. And she said, "Hi, is this 1-800-BUY-A-HOUSE-FOR-SUPERCRAZYCHEAP.org? Yes, I'm looking to buy a house. You see, I'm at Camp Simatonga this week. We're learning about loving our neighbors as ourselves, and I got to thinking, it would be so much easier to love my neighbor if all of the people in my neighborhood had enough money not to have any big needs. Can you help me find a house in maybe a middle upper class neighborhood? No, I don't mind sharing some flour every now and then, just nothing serious. You can help me? Oh, thank you. I was getting worried about following Jesus." She hangs up her phone. She walks off the stage. A boy comes in from the other side. He's got a phone in his hand. He says, "Hi, is this 1-800-BUY-A-HOUSE-FOR-SUPERCRAZYCHEAP.org? Yes, I'm looking to buy a home. You see, we're at Camp Simatonga this week, and our morning scripture came from Isaiah. It said the house of God will be a house of prayer for all people." And I got to thinking, it would be so much easier to love my neighbor as myself if all the people in my neighborhood looked like me. You know, liked the same things as me, had the same interests as me. He said, "Hold on." He pulled out a list out of his pocket. He said, "I have a list here. I like football, not baseball too much, definitely not tennis. I like pineapple on my pizza. In fact, if I email you this list, can you find me a house in a neighborhood where everyone is like me?" You can. This place is a ministry. He hangs up the phone, walks off the stage. The last camper comes in, and she's not as upbeat as the first two. She's got her head down. She's kind of moping, and she says, "Hi, is this 1-800-BUY-A-HOUSE-FOR-SUPERCRAZYCHEAP? Yes, I'm looking for a house. It's not for me. We live in kind of a hard part of town, and my neighbor, she was heating with propane. She knocked it over. It burnt her house to the ground. She's been living with us. It's really tight. Are there any homes available around here?" No, I know about the failing schools. I know about the crime. But we need a house close to here so we can take care of her. I'm at camp this week learning about loving our neighbors as ourselves. And God, following Jesus is so hard. She hung up the phone and walked off the stage. They ended the skit with the most succinct summary of the parable of the Good Samaritan that I've ever heard. Like this. A lawyer asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" To which Jesus replied, "No one who can afford to live on your side of town." It was a holy moment at Camp Sumatanga. The top of the assembly hall split open. A seraph swooped down, picked up a hot coal from the fire, and touched each of those campers' lips. They spoke a prophetic truth that you and I know deep down, but we hate to admit it. Jesus requires more of us. I think the campers give us a clue to why the sheep loved Christ, even though they didn't know it was him. Perhaps the only difference between the sheep and the goats is that the sheep had friends from places like Nazareth. The sheep had friends on the wrong side of town. When you live in a poor neighborhood and your neighbor next door gets their water cut off, well, you go to Walmart and you buy that bright orange 5-gallon cooler, you fill it up with water and you leave it on their porch. It doesn't cost you much, but it means the world to them. And when that young mother, 3 houses down on the left, she's got all those kids, she's working all those jobs, you know she's struggling to feed those kids and pay the lights, so you put a little extra broth in the pot, you throw a little extra meat in there. It's not a big deal to you. And when that old woman directly across the street gets sick again, you bring her over and you put her on the couch and you nurse her back to health. Why? Because if you don't, no one will. And that boy, he's 5 houses down that way on the left. He's a good kid, but he's in trouble again. He keeps hanging out with the wrong kids. He's in trouble this time. He's in the county jail. Well, you're going to dress up and you're going to go to his hearing and speak on his behalf. Because you know if you show up, the outcome will be different. Perhaps the only difference between the sheep and the goats is that the sheep had friends from places like Nazareth. I'm convinced that the goats were good people. They said, "Jesus, if we had known it was you, we would have been there." I think the goats went to church. They tithed 10%. They said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir." They went to Sunday school, which is more than many of you. The goats simply stayed out of the wrong side of town. Perhaps the most striking part of the parable is whom Jesus identifies with. He doesn't say, "Look at me, I'm the model sheep. Watch how I love people in poverty and do the same." No. He says, "I am hungry. I am thirsty. I am naked. I am sick. I am in prison." So the imperative of the story is to love people in poverty, not to imitate Christ, but so you might know Christ. In the first chapter of John, when Philip runs across town to find Nathanael, and Nathanael says, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Philip's response, "Come and see. Come and see. He's teaching, he's healing, it's amazing. I can't bring him over to your side of town, but please, come and see." I wrestled with this parable for years, and it didn't click for me until 2015 when Caitlin and I moved into Birmingham's West End. And within just 2 months of living in the neighborhood, I met more hungry, thirsty, imprisoned, sick people without doctor, without insurance, than I had the rest of my life combined. That was 10 years ago. It has never been clearer to me that we are not bringing Jesus into West End. We're meeting him there. Ernestine Washington was a 68-year-old widow. She officially fostered 19 kids, raised countless more, and on any given night of the week, there would be kids and adults without a safe place to stay, sleeping on the couch and floor of her 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house. One night I was over at Ernestine's house and she said, "Pastor, do you know what I want more than anything in the world?" I said, "Ernestine, what's that?" She said, "I want a bigger house so more of these folks without a safe place to be can have a home." I know lots of people who want bigger houses. Ernestine's the only person that I've ever met that wanted a bigger home so more homeless people could live in it. Can anything good come from Nazareth? At Urban Ministry, we serve a lot of food. We have a pay-as-you-can cafe, serves lunch 5 days a week. If you're ever in Birmingham, you need to come over for lunch. On the weekends, folks from our church who live in the neighborhood cook for each other. Now, on this one Sunday, we were having a big meal, probably serving 100 to 150 people. And one of the perks of helping cook and clean is, well, you get to take some food home if there's any extra. Well, Mrs. Barnes wasn't going to miss a chance like that. She is 85 years old. She showed up to Urban real early. She started dicing peppers and onions. She helped cook the food. She served behind the line. She stayed late to help sweep and clean up. Finally, when everything was over, she and I were the last two to leave the building. We were walking down Urban Ministries' long hall toward the exit, and she had 2 to-go boxes in her hand that were filled to bursting. And as we walked, she said, "Pastor, I'm so grateful for this food. I didn't know what I was going to eat tonight or for the next few days. And Jesus provides if only you trust him. I don't eat very much. I might can stretch this an entire week. Oh, praise Jesus." When we get to the back door, I open it up, and there's a man there who appears to be homeless. He says, "Y'all have any extra food?" Well, I step in front of Miss Barnes and I say, "Now you listen here. You know what time we serve. It's an hour and a half after. There's no more food. You come back tomorrow and you come on time." Before I finished speaking, somebody elbowed me in the ribs. Couldn't have been her. She's 85. She almost knocked me to the ground. Right? She reached out both to-go boxes and said, "Here, baby, there's just enough for you." And then she smiled at me, turned, and walked home because her family can't afford a car. Can anything good come from that side of town? Mary lived about 3 blocks from Urban. One Sunday, she started bringing a 3-year-old girl to church that wasn't her own. The girl's mother had fallen on hard times and asked if Mary could keep her, and Mary said, "Yeah, I'll take her to church on Sundays." I still remember the first Sunday she brought the baby girl. The little girl was quiet, kind of disheveled, looked down at her feet, and she wouldn't say a word. Week after week, Mary kept bringing the child to church. After several months, we got a little worried because the child wasn't speaking, and we had never known a 3-year-old who didn't have stuff to say. One Sunday, the girl had this fit of rage like I've never seen before. It seemed to be out of nowhere. She was cussing and screaming and yelling, and we worked together to calm her down. She was back the next week. One Sunday I was preaching, and during the service, the girl's mother showed up unexpectedly. She kind of came inside our little sanctuary, and she made eye contact with her child and beckoned her to come. When the girl saw her mother, she started pushing over chairs and screaming, saying, "Don't make me go, don't make me go." And she clawed us as we handed the screaming child to her mother, and we listened to her yell all the way down that long hallway. But the next Sunday, she was back, and the Sunday after that. One night after church, Mary called me crying. She said, "Pastor, I was bathing the child tonight, and I noticed there's bruises all over her little back. Many of them look like hand marks. I don't know what to do." Well, we cried, and we prayed, and we wrestled hard with what to do, and we decided to call DHR. Now, DHR came in quick. They removed the child from the dangerous situation, but they also cut her off from everyone who loved her. I couldn't talk to the child. Mary couldn't talk to the child. The church could have no contact with the child. Week after week, I called the social worker, and they said the same thing. "We're sorry, Pastor. We're doing an investigation. No one can have any contact with the child." I called weekly for 6 months. Nothing. Finally, I just said a prayer, and I said, "God, this is in your hands. I don't know what to do about it now." And I let it go. But not Mary. Mary kept calling week after week after week after week. And after a year and a half of persistent calls, the courts granted Mary full custody of the child. I still remember the first Sunday she brought her back to church. She turned the corner of that long hall. She had on this bright pink dress. Her hair was made up with these 2 poofy balls on top. She ran all the way down the hall, jumped into my arms, and she said, Pastor Garrett, do you like my dress? Do you like my hair? Do you like my doll?" I heard her talk more in 20 seconds than I had her entire life. She said, "Pastor Garrett, we need to go to your office because I need to call your mom." I said, "My mom? You don't know my mom." She said, "Now that's a problem, isn't it?" So I carried her down to the office. I sat down, dialed my mom, gave her the phone. She told my mother all about her doll and her dress and her hair. Finally, I said, "All right, baby girl, it's time for church. Go on." She left my office. I closed the door, and I broke down in tears. I felt called to ministry since I was 12 years old. And that was the first moment of my life that I had experienced resurrection. What was dead was alive. What was lost was found. What was mute could now speak. Can anything good come from that side of town? Come and see. Come and see. On the final day of judgment, the Son of Man will come in all of his glory, and he will separate all of us as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left, and then he'll look at Mary. And he'll say, "Mary, when I was hungry and thirsty, you fed me. When I was beaten and abused, you cared for me. When everyone gave up on me, you never quit." But unlike the people in the parable, Mary's heard it before. She won't be confused. She'll stand up tall. She'll look Jesus right in the eye and say, "I know, Lord. I've seen your face so clearly in my daughter every single day." Amen.